In this video, we'll look at the bookends of academic writing, introductions and conclusions. First, let's look at basic essay writing structure. It has three parts: the introduction, a body section which is split into paragraphs, and a conclusion section. Everything you do will have a word count, and you have to operate within the percentage of the word count for each section. This is just a guide, but roughly the introduction and conclusion sections take 5% of the word count each, while the body takes 90%. The introduction. It's the first section the marker reads, so it's really important. It sets the tone. It positions the reader. It sets the context. It says, this is what you're writing about. It's the topic. It gives the position of the paper. It's your perspective, what we call the thesis or the thesis statement. And it sets out the organisation of the paper, the structure. The conclusion. The conclusion wraps up the paper. It summarises briefly, and importantly, it concludes something. It gives the main takeaway message for the reader. Let's look at each of these more closely. Let's look at the introduction in more detail. You start with general statements to set context, provide background. It says to the reader, this is what we're talking about. Remember, the reader may not know what you know, having done the research that you've done. So you may need to define terms. It moves to more specific information from the general that narrows the topic to the focus area of this particular paper, so it offers a position of the paper, the thesis. It offers a clear structure in order. Let's look at an example question, this one from law. And the first question we ask ourselves is, what are we talking about? What's the larger issue? It seems to be here the protection of human rights. So the context, the start of the introduction will be about this, protecting human rights. Then we move on, and we can see that there's a question raised by the language used, not the best way. What does this suggest to you? It suggests that there's a position to be taken of agreement or disagreement, and maybe some idea that there could be other ways that we can protect human rights. So this becomes the focus position for the paper, the thesis. Then look at the direction word, discuss. So we need to think about and present this issue in different ways, maybe from an agreement perspective or a disagreement perspective, even both. Let's look at an example introduction. Take 30 seconds to read it. See what you notice about it. What you might notice is that it's too general. It's too vague. It uses cliché, overused language, a big problem. Nowadays, many researchers. First person is used, I will argue. The position is given, but no detail. 3 clear ways. It's a shopping list style of writing. It lacks flow and linking. It's repetitive. This is not a good example. Let's look at another example. Take 30 seconds to read this one. See what you notice. What you may notice is that it starts with the topic and a brief explanation of that topic with a citation. It then moves on to frame or focus the issue very clearly, and then gives a clear position and a thesis in a 3-part structure. This is a much better introduction, and it doesn't use I, it uses this essay, proposes that. There are lots of verbs you can use in your thesis statement: proposes, argues, examines, analyses. This is a really good example. Let's move on to the conclusion. This is where we wrap up, provide a logical, strong finish to the paper. There's no new material here. We need to reference the question, the central topic, or the thesis. We summarise briefly, but this is not all we do. Don't stop here. We need to conclude something, provide that main takeaway message for the reader. It answers the question, what do I now know? Using the example we've been using, it might answer the question, are international treaties the best way to protect human rights? It may also offer a solution or future next steps. Crucially, it needs to conclude something and answer the central question, what do I now know? So, let's look at an example. Take 30 seconds to read this. See what you notice. what you might notice that it is just a summary. It's not even a very good one. Don't just repeat the language you used in the introduction. And it's a final cliche, nothing sentence. It really does give us nothing to move away with as a final message. It's not powerful. This is not a good example. Let's look at a second example. Take 30 seconds to read this. Again, we're following a layered approach. So we can restate briefly what the paper covered. We will state what we have concluded from having done this paper, what we now know, and look at that great language it uses. It therefore concludes that. Very clear. And then we can provide some next steps or future directions. Again, look at that layered approach. It's clear, it's strong, a really good finish. So, in conclusion, what do we now know? The intro and conclusion bookend the paper. They have very important opening and closing functions. A tip? Consider writing the intro and conclusion last, after the body. For more tips and resources, search for Academic Skills UniMelb.